Hi, welcome back to the Follet video book. Today we'll finish up chapter 4. And while this section isn't really inappropriate, I know what's wrong with me, I hope you find it stimulating. So if you're comfortable and ready to begin, let's start. She was asleep on a big overstuffed couch, curled up with her head resting on a pillow. She was wearing blue jeans with the cuffs rolled up to her calves and a black gabardine western shirt with chenille embroidered blue flowers outlined in white with burgundy stems on the breast, smile pockets, and mother-of-pearl snap buttons down the front with 5 on each sleeve. Over her left breast was embroidered Sue's in red. Her fine, straight black hair was cut in a shaggy pixie cut. Follet walked to her, and in her dream she opened pale blue eyes and stood to embrace him. In her dream she was naked, and he was barefoot but wore loose-fitting blue jeans but nothing else. He was surprised to find that his forearms and chest were hairy, and when he reached to scratch his jaw he wore a full beard. Suze held him for a minute and then broke gently away and took his hand, leading him to a table with a small pillow at one end covered by a white sheet. As she climbed on the table and lay on her back, Follet noticed that besides the luxuriant forest of hair between her legs and underarms were unshaven. He leaned over her and kissed her, their mouths opening to each other. When his tongue touched hers, he felt an electric shock that caused the skin on his arms to rise in goosebumps. He broke the kiss and looked down at her. "Give me the back of your hand," she told him. Follet held out his right hand to her, and she took it in hers and turned it over so that the back of his hand was close to her mouth. Suze smiled at him, her eyes twinkling in anticipation. "Watch," she said. She opened her mouth and let her tongue stick out, raising her head so that it hung just below his hand. It was so close to him that he could feel her warm, moist breath on his skin. Then the tip of her tongue touched his hand. It felt like tiny needles piercing his flesh, and as she moved her mouth over the back of his hand, her tongue brought a new stinging sensation to wherever it touched. He could feel her tongue moving, and as he looked, she turned his hand, and her moving head revealed dark lines becoming a pattern on his skin as her tongue pierced him and left her mark. A stylized red poppy edged in black. The skin on either side of the design flamed an angry, irritated red, but the sensation of Suze piercing his skin to leave her mark on him, her saliva penetrating him, boring into him, was intoxicating. She finished and gave him his hand back. "See," she whispered. Follet nodded, and Suze lay back on the table, resting her head on the pillow. Follet stepped back from the table to look at her. She was skinny, her breasts were small, but her dark nipples were long and stood up at attention in the middle of areoles that were large and a shade darker. He moved back to the table and bent over her neck. She reached for him and lay a soft hand on his shoulder. He moved his mouth to the soft cleft between her clavicles, using only his lips to kiss her there. She gasped softly and told him, "Yes, start there." He let his tongue escape his mouth and touch her velvety flesh. She inhaled through her teeth as the tiny needles of his kiss pricked her skin and left his mark. He moved his tongue, and when he pulled away to survey his work, he smiled when he saw that she now bore a red rose, each petal edged with a fine dark blue border tattooed in that delicate place. He moved back to her then, and let his tongue decorate both of her clavicles, moving out toward his shoulders from the rose. On the pure skin that covered both of those beautiful bones, he let the needles of his kiss create leafy vines that grew from the rose and were covered in almost hidden buds that promised more blooms. By the time he had finished with these tattooing kisses, Suze was held in a burning reverie somewhere between stings and caresses. "Lower," she breathed. Follet moved to her sternum. Once again he touched the tip of his tongue to her skin, relishing the feeling as she breathed in through her nostrils, making no other sound. His tongue traced a dragon's head, mouth open, about to devour the rose above. As he moved his head lower, his dripping tongue moved over her and created wings that spread just under the vines on her collarbones, the tips pointing to her shoulders. The bottoms of the wyvern's wings arced over her breasts, framing them. He moved back to her center and let the dark design move lower, the dragon's body curling around itself in an interlaced Celtic knot that moved down her chest and then to her belly so that its forked tail caressed her navel. Follet then began again at her belly button and licked up until he had covered the entire dragon in his spit. When he pulled away to survey his work, he saw that the dragon's body, which was outlined in black, was filled with tiny scales in all the colors of the rainbow. "More," she told him, "please." Follet smiled. Roll over onto your stomach and put your hands out in front of you, wrists together. Follet walked around to the head of the table and stood before her outstretched hands. He took her left hand in both of his and lowered his mouth to her. He touched his tongue to the mound of Venus on her left palm and moved to touch where a throbbing pulse beat just under the skin of her wrist. He moved his tongue in tiny diamond shapes and then moved on across her wrist to the outside, lifted her hand so that he could tongue the back of her wrist, and continued circling kisses on her skin, pausing randomly until he had reached about 4 inches up her forearm from where he had begun. He pulled his mouth away to look at her arm and smiled at the result. The golden lines that looked almost silken were braided in 3 strands, creating a rope that wound around her arm up from her wrist, interrupted at seemingly random intervals by diamond heishi knots. The strands of the rope tattoo were even and precisely aligned. Follet carefully released her left hand and took her right. He lowered his mouth to her again and recreated the left arm's design on her right. The only difference between the two was that the placement of the diamond knots on her right arm, wrist, and arm did not match that of the knots on her left. Before letting her right arm go, he lowered his mouth to her wrist again, opening his lips, and let his tongue lave her skin. When he took his mouth away, he saw half a red heart lying atop the rope design that covered her wrist. He took her left hand and kissed the same spot on her there, creating the mirror image of the broken heart. He held on to her left hand and then took her right hand in his, pushing her wrists together. When the 2 wrists met, the design of the kinbaku ropes seemed to bind both wrists tightly together and make the 2 broken hearts whole. Since Suze was now lying on her belly, Follet continued on her back. He kissed his way across her right shoulder blade, moving halfway down her rib cage, creating a tall swan. Close to the point of her left shoulder, at the outer edge of her shoulder blade, his tongue traced a tiny red-breasted blue hummingbird. He then began with kisses in the small of her back, and moving up, drawing pairs of eyelets laced with purple ribbons. The ends of the bow of the purple ribbons fell just onto the tops of her ass cheeks. As the laces moved up her back, they seemed to part to create an opening. Follet kissed the ends of the laces so that they were held in the mouths of the swan and the hummingbird. He moved back to where the laces seemed to open and licked a cloud of small black birds coursing up to the nape of her neck. Suze was breathing quickly and heavily now. Follet looked at the far end of the table, and by her feet he saw 2 huge blue glass bottles with glass stoppers. He moved to that end of the table and took the stopper from one bottle. He lifted the bottle to breathe in its fragrance and smelled almonds and cocoa butter. Maybe there was a hint of tangerine. With his other hand he reached under her left foot and lifted it so that she bent her knee, her soft sole facing up. He poured a little of the fragrant oil onto her arch, the slippery liquid coating her sole. Smiling as she gasped it flowed down her ankle toward her calf. He put down the bottle and reached for her calf, feeling the oil touch the heel of his hand. He moved his hand to her foot, covering his palm with the oil. He rubbed his hands together and put one hand on either side of her heel so that he could rub her there with his thumbs. He massaged the top of her foot with his fingers while he rubbed the oil into her sole. He paid attention to her heel and then to her arch, then the ball of her foot, rubbing the mound of each toe in tiny circles. He paused for a minute to pour more oil onto the ball of her foot before continuing to fondle each toe. This little piggy went to market. This little piggy stayed home. This little piggy had roast beef, and this little piggy had none. And he placed her last little piggy, her big toe, in his mouth, sucking on her as she sighed. As he had paid similar attention to her right foot, he gently laid her lower legs back down onto the table. He grabbed one of the blue bottles and poured oil into the palm of his hand. He could feel the oil warming in his hand, and he waited. When he rubbed his palms together to coat his palms and fingers with the oil, he found that the blood-warm oil seemed to shimmer on his hands. Follet placed his right hand with his thumb overlapping her right heel, and his fingers softly wrapped around her ankle. He put his left hand on top of his right and slowly slid his hands up her leg, massaging her Achilles tendon with his thumbs and his fingers and around to the bottom of her shin. His hands moved up to her calf. He softly rubbed the back of her knee and moved his hands up her thigh, rubbing and kneading her muscles. As his hands moved closer to the top of her thigh and the bottom of her buttock, Suze moved her hips and spread her legs slightly apart. He let his fingers massage the outside of her thigh and her inner thigh, while his thumbs pushed into the center of her hamstring muscles. She moaned softly and spread her legs a little farther apart. Follet took his hands from her. He picked up the other bottle of oil, poured more onto his palms, and let it warm in his hands. When it had warmed, he began with her left foot, repeating the massage up her leg, closer, always closer to the beautiful cleft of her ass. He took his time, making sure to touch every inch of her skin and manipulate every muscle under her skin. As he finished with her left leg, he moved his hands apart and squeezed the round globes of her ass, leaving his oily handprints on her skin. Follet moved to the spot just above the cleft of her ass, where the ends of the ribbon's bow that he had tattooed in the small of her back parted. He moved his mouth to her and smiled as she moaned again at the touch of his lips. He let his tongue touch her and began the marking. She breathed in sharply as he began. His kisses drew a sprig of lily of the valley blooming at the bottom of her spine. It was delicate, about an inch tall, and leaned to the right. Just above and below this tiny bunch of flowers, Follet added a border that seemed to pass under the bow's ribbons. He continued the border straight up to her hips on each side and returned to fill the space of what could now be seen as a belt with ivy leaves and ferns that looked like Sheridan-style tooled leather. "Roll on to your left side," he told her, and when she had done so, Follet continued to create her belt with his tongue, placing another ivy sprig just behind the point of her hip, flanked by intertwined leaves of the ferns and ivy. "Roll onto your back," he told her. Follet continued the belt across her abdomen, just above the bush of her pubic hair. In the center, just below her navel, he added another sprig. The belt continued across her until he got to her other hip. "Roll on to your right side," he told her. When she had done so, Follet placed the final sprig of lilies and completed the belt. "Roll over onto your back again," he said, "and raise your left foot." She lay on the table and raised her left leg so that it was bent at the knee, with her foot resting on the table. Follet began at her ankle. He placed his tongue just above her ankle bone and began to create a spray of paisley, a fountain of bent cedar trees moving up her leg, the symbol of strength and the tree that was planted in paradise. The spray followed the shape of her lower leg and then continued on up her thigh, ending just below her belt of lilies, ferns, and ivy. When he had finished, he looked at her, from the top of her head down to her feet. He smiled and said, "Well, look at you." She lay on her back and looked up at him. She smiled and whispered, "Well, look at you." She sat up on the edge of the table, looking him up and down. When Follet looked at her, puzzled, she said, "Come with me." She hopped off the table and took his hand, leading him into another room. There was her bed again, and a full-length mirror on the wall. As they walked toward the mirror, Follet moved behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders, moving her ahead of him so that she could see his handiwork. "Look," he told her. She looked into the mirror, and her mouth opened in involuntary surprise. "I'm beautiful," she whispered. "You were beautiful before I added the decoration," he told her. He turned it to him and moved his mouth to her right breast, just next to her areole, and opened his mouth to suck her soft breast into his mouth, sucking as she moaned at the sensation, and breaking that kiss when he knew that he had left his mark, a dark bruise to remind her of her dream. He straightened and faced her, and she laughed softly and said, "Now I want you to see your adornment." She took him by the shoulders and turned him around so that he could see himself in the mirror. His jaw dropped and his mouth opened before he began to smile. For every mark he had made on Suze, her dream had made one on him. Where he had left a rose and vines, her dream had left an interwoven Celtic band composed of two sinuous dragons facing one another. Where he had inscribed a dragon between her breasts, her dream had marked him with a bright red arcane medical drawing of a human heart, which sprouted green leaves from its arteries and veins. She left him gazing at himself for a minute and came back with a hand mirror. She gave it to him and turned him around so that he could look at his back in the mirror. Where he had left a swan and a hummingbird on her shoulders, her dream had inked two ravens on his, each reaching out with a talon to seemingly pull his skin apart to reveal a clockwork mechanism underneath. Where he had inscribed a tooled belt on her hips, her dream had left an Escher-like strip that metamorphosed from a checkerboard into a swarm of salamanders, from salamanders into horses, from horses into birds, and from birds back into squares as they circled his hips. Where he had colored paisleys onto the side of her leg, her dream had tattooed his leg as if it were incised porcelain. She moved in front of him and into his embrace. "Let's go to bed," she whispered. Follet nodded, and she took his hand, leading him back to her bed. As they walked across the room hand in hand, the floor turned to mist, and the room lost its definition. By the time they had walked another step, Follet found himself standing alone, staring at Suze, who was curled up asleep on the couch. He raised his hand to feel his face and found himself again clean-shaven. When he looked at the back of his right hand, Sue's flower had disappeared, but he could still feel her warm breath on the back of his hand. Follet walked back through the house, edged into the alley, and found his way back to his car. He drove through the streets of the little town looking for the highway. He found it, this time heading north or south. He turned right and headed out of town. Some key lime pie would taste mighty good now, he thought.